intro. So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on and attending this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am a programming librarian here at Cary Library. Before we begin, please let me know in the chat if there are any technical issues that I can try to resolve. And I want to acknowledge that this program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation. With us this evening is Rosemary Salomone, the Kenneth Wang Professor at St. John's University School of Law. She is a linguist, a lawyer, and a professor of constitutional, administrative, and comparative law. She's also the author of The Rise of English, Global Politics and the Power of Language, as you can see on the screen there. She's lectured internationally and published extensively on education law and policy, comparative equality, and language rights. Before joining the Legal Academy, she taught English to international students at Columbia University, developed bilingual programs for immigrant students in New York City, and was a faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she taught education law and language policy. Now, please welcome Rosemary.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the book. I have some PowerPoint slides that I'll be working through. What initially led me to writing a book on the rise of English were legal disputes in Italy and France in 2013. And they were disputes over the use of English in teaching university courses. So as I started unpacking those disputes, it really became clear to me that English has enormous force as a dominant lingua franca. And it's linked very clearly to both globalization and internationalization. I also saw the direct impact on educational equity, identity, and the knowledge economy. That very tentative beginning ultimately took me on a 7-year journey through 7 languages, 7 countries, and a vast store of scholarship. Along the way, I encountered the work of activists, political philosophers, jurists, economists, linguists, and literary icons. I interviewed a number of them, and they were all within and beyond the Western canon. So putting it all together, my aim was to capture what I had learned into a book, but it had to be a book that would be accessible to a wide and international audience, and a book that would look at English and its sweeping effects, both past and present, but also with an eye to the near future. Guiding me along the way were 2 interrelated precepts. The first was that politics in a given geographic and historical setting shape and reshape language policies and languages over time. The second one was that government policies that maintain an unequal relationship among languages carry very serious economic, political, and social consequences, not only for the speakers of those languages, but for the countries that those speakers call home, whether by chance or by choice. As I mulled over the concept of a lingua franca, I instinctively turned to the works of Dante Alighieri, dusting off my old copies of various works of Dante, the medieval poet, moral philosopher, and father of modern Italian. And I was looking for, really initially for an appropriate quote, but even an insight on the power of the vernacular in the face of a dominant lingua franca. For Dante, it was Latin. I found that inspiration in a visit to Ravenna, Italy in 2018, and Ravenna's annual music and cultural festival. There, on a beautiful, warm summer evening, my husband and I joined with 100 cittadini, local citizens, reciting verses from La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy, before Dante's tomb. And you see a photo of that here. This was followed by a procession through the streets of Ravenna, and we were led by a drummer beating a drum in a haunting kind of way. And he led us to this local theater and a live performance of the Inferno. That experience was just earth-shaking to me, and it made palpable the enduring force of language in defining a community. So moving on to the book, I'd like to first talk a bit about the dominance of English. As many of you know, English is everywhere. It's an official language of the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, and NATO. Across the globe, there are more non-native speakers of English than native speakers. For young people, no matter where they live, English governs the books they read, the films and television programs they watch, the cultural values they absorb, and their career options. English accounts for 60% of internet content. Without a doubt, English both fuels the global economy and rides on it. But we all know that the spread of English was not an accident. It started with the British Empire, which at its height covered a quarter of the world. A core strategy of colonialism was to control language. The colonial powers of Western Europe devalued local languages and knowledge. And in doing that, they preserved the colonial myth that these languages could not function beyond everyday life. In the mid-20th century, just as the British Empire was unraveling and Europe was recovering from a devastating war, the United States was able to grow the importance of English through political, economic, and cultural influence. For many years, multinational corporations and international development organizations also helped drive the spread of English in newly independent countries. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the British Council, the British Department of International Development, and the U.S. Agency for International Development all pushed a pro-English agenda. To this day, relying on English while excluding indigenous and local languages has been a serious blind spot in many of the countries receiving that aid. In any case, while a common language, certainly for sure, we know is economically valuable, diplomatically valuable, and brings many intercultural benefits, English has also divided the world into haves and have-nots and created political and cultural strains across the globe. But rather than summarily conclude that English is bad, good, or neutral, whether it's a global panacea or a killer language, as some commentators have held, I set out to explore the nuanced effects of English and its global dominance. I decided to look through the lens of education. Education is long considered the ultimate social leveler and a vehicle for creating social and political stability through a shared language and values. It's also where English has raised a lot of concerns over national identity, equal opportunity, and the quality of instruction. My initial plan was to write a book on the value of language in the global economy, examining winners, losers, and resistors on both sides of the Atlantic. But the deeper I dug into the research and the more world events evolved, the connections to the post-colonial world began to take shape. So did the forces of globalization and internationalization. It especially became clear that language and languages have become strategic economic assets in themselves. And so the book evolved into three interrelated parts. The first part looks at Europe and the European Union. In Europe, the debate over English largely runs along two streams. The first has to do with the growing use of English in EU institutions, despite the EU recognizing 24 languages among its member states. This has been especially troubling to France, whose language was in the past considered the language of diplomacy, literature, and high culture. President Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly stated that he would like to make French the official language of the EU. For some EU officials, especially those from Eastern Europe who spent a considerable amount of time and energy learning English, moving to French is not an acceptable option. English increasingly is becoming the favored language of both formal and informal communication within EU institutions. Meanwhile, in the wake of Brexit, the number of native English speakers in the EU is now quite small, essentially limited to Ireland and Malta, which has amplified the debate over English. Yet it cannot be overlooked that across Europe, close to 100% of students study English at some point in their education, many of them as their primary foreign language. So it seems unlikely that English will be abandoned as a primary working language in EU institutions in favor of French or German, at least anytime soon. The second point of concern in Europe centers on the rising number of English taught programs and courses, what we call EMI, English Medium Instruction, in European universities. Universities use English for a number of reasons: to drive internationalization and burnish their reputations globally, to prepare their own students for the global economy, and in some cases to raise revenue. Here, the debate revolves around quality and access, the burdens on students and faculty who don't speak English fluently, and the preservation of national languages and identity. English taught programs tend to favor students who have benefited from high-quality English in well-resourced schools and from private tutoring provided by their parents. Many students have difficulty mining the depths of English reading assignments while their writing lacks nuance and substance. The move toward English has fallen equally hard on professors. Faculty hiring and promotions, especially in the hard sciences, are increasingly based on citations in indexed English language journals. Meanwhile, academic conferences are now conducted only or primarily in English, which really denies professors who lack a strong ability in English very important networking opportunities. Where higher education is state-funded, as is common in Europe, publishing solely in English denies many taxpayers access to important information affecting their daily lives. Even the Nordic countries and the Netherlands, and they were the ones that spearheaded English taught programs, even they are now questioning whether they may have gone too far and at what cost to educational equity, quality, and to the national language. Heated debates in France and Italy have raised many of these concerns. In 2003, and that's where the book really started, intellectuals in France sparred over legal changes that permitted more flexibility for universities to teach in languages other than French, but it was essentially English they were talking about. Yet by 2021, France had jumped to fourth place in Europe, excluding the UK, in the number of English language programs. In 2017, the Italian Constitutional Court struck down a plan to switch all graduate programs to English in Milan's very prestigious Polytechnic Institute. There, the court upheld the right of students and to learn in their own language, in their national language, and the right of professors to teach in the national language. Yet the majority of courses, the graduate courses at the Institute, are still offered only in English. Again, France, above all, as I've mentioned already, has really tried mightily to preserve its national language and its international status. Emmanuel Macron, again, has put great effort into resetting the colonial narrative in former colonies, and especially in Africa, where English is weakening France's grip. Macron has suggested that French become the #1 language in Africa. He's also suggested that it could become the #1 language of the world. African leaders have been pragmatically more receptive to that kind of discourse. Africa's intellectual elite, however, largely view those efforts as a sign of neocolonialism. France's prime competitor in Africa is China. Like France, China has used the soft power of language to strengthen diplomatic and commercial ties in Africa. China is essentially cashing in on Africa's demographic dividend. About 60% of Africa's 1.3 billion people are now under the age of 25, with a median age of 19.7. China is using what has been called soft power, or perhaps smart power, investing in education and language learning, along with other strategies. For young Africans, Chinese language skills translate into jobs. For Chinese investors, they reduce the cost of doing business in African countries. Between 2003 and 2018, the number of African students studying in China grew from 1,800 to a whopping over 81,000. There are now over 60 Confucius Institutes in Africa. These are joint programs with African universities. To what extent Chinese will replace French or English on the African continent, of course, remains to be seen. Well, that brings us to the post-colonial world. There, more generally, the debate over English primarily revolves around the language of instruction in elementary and secondary schools and the importance of teaching children in a language that they understand, despite the market value of English and the loss of regional and indigenous languages. At the same time, the debate has put a spotlight on disparities in the quality of English taught to the rich and to the poor. Here we find overlapping justifications for officially adopting English, from economic mobility in India and Morocco to the added push toward redress and transformation in South Africa, and to some extent also in Rwanda. What I found in each of these countries was a distinct linguistic landscape and history. In formerly French-speaking Rwanda, for example, resolving the 1990s genocide moved the country to shift officially toward English in 2008. How that came to be is a complicated story of conflict between the Tutsi, who became English-speaking while they were in exile in Uganda, and the French-speaking Hutus, and the role that France played in the conflict. Until 2003, French and Kinyarwanda, which is also the national language, remained the country's two official languages. At that time, the Constitution formally adopted English as a third. Unlike many post-colonial countries, Rwanda is practically monolingual. Upwards of 99% of the population speaks Kinyarwanda. In 2008, the government switched all instruction to English without any preparation for teacher training or material development. The results on student learning were absolutely dreadful. In 2011, under pressure from international organizations like UNICEF, the government reverted to teaching in Kinyarwanda in grades 1 through 3. In Morocco, it's been a question of navigating the country's Arab roots, along with preserving Tamazight, the language commonly spoken by most Moroccans, while recognizing the value of English in the global economy. Both Arabic and Tamazight are the country's official languages. For many Moroccans, French is an undesirable remnant of French colonialization. In 2019, the education minister announced that French would remain the second language after Arabic in Moroccan public schools, at least for the next 10 years, to develop a core of teachers competent in English. Many Moroccans took to social media, arguing that English, the language of globalization, should be the primary foreign language. In South Africa, English has become caught up in the struggle to address the legacy of apartheid. The official languages include English and Afrikaans, along with 9 African languages. The Black population sees Afrikaans as the language of oppression, and English as the language of resistance and liberation. Yet white Afrikaners and the colored or mixed race population still push to preserve Afrikaans, especially in schools and universities. The Constitutional Court has repeatedly been called on to resolve those conflicts in moving the country toward transformation and redress. In a series of high-profile cases, the court has upheld university policies, switching entirely or primarily to English instruction, with various accommodations given to Afrikaans. It seems that the court has tried mightily to go beyond the past by supporting English while promoting multilingualism, especially African languages. At the same time, more recently, in a case challenging a plan to phase out Afrikaans at the University of South Africa, and that's large, it's entirely a distance learning program at UNISA, the court suggested decoupling Afrikaans from the memory of apartheid and even placing it among Africa's indigenous languages. Yet, to what extent Afrikaans fits under this multilingual umbrella we see developing in South Africa, that remains highly contested. In India, English competes on a wide linguistic terrain of regional politics. Multilingualism is built into a federal system of 29 states and 7 union territories defined largely by language. India is almost unique in the large numbers of people who speak more than one language. That said, English has enjoyed a favored place in government and schooling since colonial times. The 1949 Constitution adopted Hindi as the, quote, official language, though not the national language. The idea was that Hindi would replace English in government within 15 years, but that never happened. The Official Languages Act of 1963 maintained English as a, quote, subsidiary official language. Parents go to extreme lengths to educate their children in English, though the quality of programs differs widely between the elite schools and the low-fee private schools that exploit the poor. In recent years, English also has become caught in a high-stakes tug-of-war between the current nationalist government promoting Hindi and the consequent pushback from speakers of other Indian languages. The government's language policy that was adopted in 2020, in fact, is noticeably silent on the role of English in the overall curriculum. So that takes us now to the third geographical and geopolitical context. And here we look at Anglophones and the monolingual mindset. The fact that English appears so pervasive has lulled Anglophones into believing that there is no need to learn other languages. The number of students studying languages in the US, but also in the UK, in fact, has sharply declined in recent decades. As I sorted through the numbers in the US, I found glaring inequities. Disadvantaged students are typically fed a steady diet of reading and math and denied foreign language learning. Racial and ethnic data on advanced placement exams in world languages show lower numbers and lower scores. Not surprisingly, similar racial and ethnic disparities also come up in study abroad programs. And yet we know that language skills are a highly valued commodity on the global market. Only a quarter of the world is even minimally competent in English. That means that monolingual speakers cannot tap into a large body of knowledge or take advantage of many career and business opportunities. Even worse, they risk the world talking over their heads while they become politically and culturally isolated. Though English is used by almost 26% of people on the internet, Chinese is not far behind at 19%. A substantial amount of internet communication also takes place in Spanish and Arabic. As those of you who are bilingual or multilingual well know, reading or listening to world events through different language media gives you a much bigger picture than limiting yourself to English-speaking outlets. It also gives you a sense of how other people are processing our politics. Yet even beyond job opportunities and foreign affairs, there's just the experience of reading the great literary masters in the original. All that said, there is a growing movement, slowly growing, but it is growing in the United States to defy what has been called the monolingual mindset and promote multilingualism. Advocates are reframing the narrative on language learning. They rely heavily on the work of Ellen Bialystock, a Canadian psychologist who's examined the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. According to Bialystock and her colleagues, bilinguals show increased attention control, working memory, and emotional intelligence that could even delay the onset of dementia in old age. Most notably, a report published in 2017 by a Commission on Language Learning has become a blueprint for increasing the number of foreign language teachers and supporting heritage language programs in the US. The most impressive development is the growth of dual language immersion programs in the schools. Here I look, in terms of dual language, I looked at 3 settings that I found particularly striking: California, Utah, and New York City. In California, the turnaround has been dramatic. Back in 1998, a voter-initiated constitutional amendment seemed to sound the death knell for bilingual programs for the state's large Spanish-speaking student population. What the initiative did, however, was actually mobilize parents and lawmakers, and that led to a counter-initiative in 2016 that brought language programs back into the schools. In Utah, what we see is just a phenomenal success in promoting dual immersion programs. What made it happen was a combination of determined allies, the governor, John Huntsman at the time, a state senator, Howard Stevenson, and a world language specialist, Greg Roberts, and most importantly, the support of the LDS Church, which trains young members to work abroad on a 2-year mission. By 2021, the program had grown from 600 students in 35 schools to 65,000 students in 285 schools. The program has been an absolute economic boon for the state. It's attracted multilingual corporations that look for workers with foreign language skills. And finally, the third setting that I looked at was one very close to me, close to home in New York City. There, the French community has sparked a bilingual revolution in the public schools with the support of the French embassy. This was a bottom-up effort by French-speaking parents who were looking for an affordable bilingual option for their children. It started with a French-English dual immersion program in one school in Brooklyn and has since spread to other schools and to other languages. And so finally, the book closes with a look at the market value of languages. A key selling point for parents, for sure, is the marketability of languages in the global economy. Upwards of 23 million jobs in the US are tied to international trade in goods and services. 16% of international business agreements are made through a cocktail of languages. Languages spoken in emerging economies like China and Latin America have become a significant part of the corporate skill set. But the need for language skills goes beyond multinational business. Given the large number of immigrants, not only in the US, but across the world, there's a rising demand for language and cross-cultural skills in the service industries, in healthcare, and in criminal justice. In urban areas with large pockets of immigrants, social service agencies, housing, education, domestic violence, child abuse, unemployment, and immigration cases demand workers who speak a variety of languages. Now, it's very tempting to simply rely on translation software to meet these needs. Yet anyone using that software knows that the output is less than perfect, although I have to say it is getting better. Translators and interpreters are often used in situations that demand on-the-spot decisions like healthcare and national security, where relying on machine translation can prove risky. The current pandemic has been a reality check on the critical need for multilingual workers in the health fields. It soon became clear that machine translation was limited in what it could do. The meaning of official advice got lost if literally translated. The English term social distancing, which we have used we've used to a very good benefit, proved ambiguous in cultures that were accustomed to socializing collectively. It just didn't have any meaning. In California, the coronavirus response website actually included a disclaimer that the state could not guarantee the accuracy of any translation provided by Google Translate, and therefore was not liable for any inaccurate information. When you think of the gravity of the consequences, you cannot make a more compelling case for human translation. And so finally, looking ahead, I end and leave you with two questions. First, can English do it all? In the end, English cannot do it all. Using a common language undoubtedly facilitates teamwork and knowledge sharing across countries. The Pfizer vaccine against COVID-19, the first to be rolled out in Europe and North America, was the product of a partnership between the US and pharmaceutical company Pfizer and the German company BioNTech. Without the use of English as a common language, it might not have developed with such unprecedented speed. If anything, the pandemic has taught us that the world is interconnected and that we need to increase our ability to speak to each other as part of a global community. The second question, is English the last lingua franca? Well, it's not unreasonable to think that another lingua franca will push English aside someday, though not in the near future. France will likely only make headway in its former French colonies. The appeal of Chinese beyond its economic and political utility remains narrow. Perhaps it will be Spanish, which is spoken on 5 major continents. But for now, policymakers around the world have to deal with both the opportunities and dangers of English, but also as a critical component of multilingualism. And so I'll end there, and I welcome comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. That was quite comprehensive and covered a lot. I just want to reiterate, if anyone has any questions, please submit them via the Q&A, or you can do the raise hand function. I can allow you to be able to talk. Perhaps while people are typing questions, I wanted to acknowledge that, like you were showing, that it takes a great amount of time for change to happen, like colonialism being several hundred years and whatnot, and then the businesses that reinforce it. Do you see, though, like with the speed of the internet and the changes that happened from the pandemic, you're kind of talking about this, but do you see that the internet or working from home influencing changes to the common languages used around the world?
No, I don't. I think I was trying to stop sharing my PowerPoints, but it's just not happening here. No, because I think if we're still doing, maybe it's even more important because it's more possible to do business internationally without travel. And so, I know lots of folks, including my own son, who does business internationally and is up at 5 o'clock in the morning talking to people across the world. I don't think it's changing it at all. It's making global business even more possible than it used to be. And there's always the hope that the person on the other end of the Zoom meeting speaks English sufficiently well, but not necessarily. And in business meetings that used to take place in person, where we were traveling to another country, there could be an interpreter in the room interpreting, and that now that isn't as easily done. So no, I don't think it's going to change the dynamic in any way.
We have a couple questions that have come in. So one person asked, I realize that Africa has many different languages in many separate countries. Wouldn't it be useful for the continent economically and socially to have a single common language?
Oh, sure. I really believe so. Within pockets of countries, Swahili is seen as a common language, for example, within certain groups of countries. But for sure, and I do make that point in the book, that we do need a common language, and that English is at this point, it's English. It might be another language it's someday, but not soon. And it does facilitate this global communication that really is important. And for a continent like Africa, for sure. For a continent like Europe as well. And we see that in the European Union, as much as there's pushback, particularly from France, that French should be the common language. It's English for now, and it's unlikely to change. And as I stated, particularly for countries in Eastern Europe or the EU officials from Eastern Europe, they didn't learn French as their second language. They were speaking Russian, before the fall of the Soviet Union. And so they put a lot of effort and time into learning English. And that just makes business, it's easy to do business across borders in Europe as well. But you have a businessman or a business person from Brazil speaking English to another business person from Japan. That's just the way people are doing business now, and it does facilitate it. I think it also facilitates diplomacy in many ways, where you have officials speaking to each other directly in a common language and not through a translator.
We have a couple more typed questions, and then there is one that's raised hand, so I'll just do it in order that I saw them appear. There's a question here from someone. Do you think the relative simplicity of English, which I would argue is not simple, as compared to Chinese, French, etc., is part of its success as a lingua franca?
I've thought of that. And English is not a simple language to learn. If you ask anyone who's tried to learn English, it really isn't simple at all. The sounds don't correspond to the visual reality of it. But it's more understandable because it's spread across the globe, through our TV programs, through films. English is just more accessible to people than other languages are. And so we think of it as being, it's simpler for everybody to speak English. It's hard for people to learn English. It really is. They just have more opportunity to learn it. And when you speak, you could speak to foreigners who will say, I learned English when I was a kid by watching cartoons, or by watching popular programs, kids programs. It's just, there's more opportunity to learn English, but it's not that it's not easier. It's easier for Westerners to learn it than it would be for them or us to learn Chinese. That's for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah. Praveen, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. Are you, we can't hear you, Praveen. I'm just seeing if I missed something. You should be able to. Well, maybe we can move on to a different question while I figure out the technical issue. There's another question in the Q&A. Does the rise of nationalism around the world make it more difficult to settle on new lingua francas?
Yeah, you see that for sure in India, where the rise of nationalism in India and the very the hard push for Hindi from the current nationalist administration is pushing English aside. So you can argue that the rise of nationalism in other countries where countries are looking inward, if you will, and not looking globally and turning their backs on globalism to what extent that they really can. You can argue that that's kind of stopping the spread of English to a certain degree, but I don't think very effectively, because India is the country that I'm most familiar with in terms of the rise of nationalism and the impact it's had on English, because India is such a multilingual country. There's such strong pushback, especially from the states in the South, that Modi is not has not been extremely successful. In fact, I wrote a commentary a couple of months ago for University World News on just this topic, and concluded that Modi may come to regret what he wished for. Because it doesn't help India in terms of their economy, not at all, for them to turn their back on English.
It's really interesting. I'll try again with Praveen as they have their hand raised. Praveen, you should be able to unmute. And still can't hear you. Maybe if you want to type your question in the Q&A, we can try to answer it that way. Seems to be some technical difficulties. What are some ways that our schools could make language learning more appealing to students, or more elaborate, and showing them like the usefulness of it outside of school?
Well, first of all, they should make it more equitably available, and they don't. Underprivileged children don't get, as I said, they don't get foreign languages. They get this steady diet of reading and math and and performing on standardized tests. They don't get enrichment programs, and languages are considered an enrichment program, but they could certainly make it more appealing. K-pop, Korean has become, and I talk about it in the book, has become a more popular language for young people in the United States to study. And it comes about through these music groups, this genre of music, K-pop, that kids are just very taken with. Well, I mean, if the schools could present it in some cultural way, in a more exciting way, an accessible kind of way, and also in a practical utilitarian way, to say to young people, this really has value on the market. Someday you could get a job if you speak another language. I tell my students when I teach my comparative equality course, I have a number of students, and in my other courses as well, who come from immigrant families. And these students very often are told by the schools, well, that's, you've had a disadvantage. This is not a resource. It's really a resource for these young people. And I say to them, you are privileged by having been exposed to another language from birth, and that you really can develop those bilingual skills that other people struggle for years to develop. So I think if you present it to students in a way that it really has some value to them, I think students would be more interested. Rather, foreign languages were always taught through literature in the past. And even now, colleges and universities are offering languages in a very different way. You can take a course in the sociology department in French, or you could take a course in the government department in Japanese or whatever. Colleges are seeing it, are teaching languages beyond just literature, and tying it to career opportunities as well. So I don't think it would be a hard sell for students. And we have so many students, young people now who are from immigrant families. We really should be developing their language skills more fully.
We have a couple more comments, and then another question if you have time. One was a comment was, in colonial India, the rise of English was used to invalidate local knowledge and literatures. So in the post-colonial moment of the rise of Hindi and Hindi nationalism is a breath of fresh air for asserting post-colonial identity. Your critique of nationalist agenda seems unfounded. Also behind India's multilingualism is a common ancient language of Sanskrit, which is the unifying thread between all Indian languages. So the push behind Hindi is supported with a common shared linguistic Sanskrit identity. Encouraging Sanskrit and Hindi in the post-colonial moment are both critical for promoting literature and literary cultures in India. Do you have a response to that comment?
Well, Hindi is a unifying language, and you could say that it's not that India does not have a national language. And the question of language in India has been very contentious from the very beginning, from Indian independence, not from the beginning, but from the time of independence. And so there are many Indians who will refute the proposition that Hindi should be the national language, and it is a unifying language. It's also a dividing language as well. because India is so multilingual. It's just so multilingual that there are many states in the South who push back against. Some of them see English as a bulwark against Hindi, and some of them embrace English again as a bulwark against Hindi. So Hindi is a unifying language for some people, for some groups in India, but not for everybody.
It looks like Praveen also typed their question. They said, looks like my question got answered. However, the learning of English and wide use of it became a status symbol and a symbol of class system when I was growing up in India in 1948 to 1965. There was a feeling among some that this adversely affected many young Indian kids who could have done better if they'd learned in their language, for example, Hindi. Now I have lived in the US for more than 50 years, and my children learned English and French, and my grandchildren English and French.
Well, I do make the point very strongly in the book that many children are taught in a language that they are taught in English, but it's a language that they don't understand. And so there's a significant body of research supporting the idea that children should learn initially in school in a language that they do understand, that it could their home language or their regional language, rather than trying to teach them in English from day one. And so there is a very strong argument that's one of the downsides of English. And yet you see parents in these post-colonial countries that really embrace English, poor parents who are just they're sending their children, to some of them in India, to these low fee paying schools where the quality of English is really poor to begin with. And the teachers themselves are not competent in English. What happened in Rwanda when Rwanda switched to English in 2008, just, changed on a dime without preparing teachers, without developing materials. The results on the testing were appalling, absolutely appalling. And it was international organizations like UNICEF that really put pressure on Rwanda and said, look, you cannot just change the whole educational system overnight. That really takes time to build that linguistic infrastructure.
They also wanted to clarify they meant English and Chinese for their grandchildren. They just added that. But maybe our last question can be, are you concerned that the United States, for example, will be accused of being a language hegemonist, which could have a negative impact on international interaction?
Sure. Yes. I think that really is a problem. We do have this sense of American exceptionalism and English exceptionalism, and we don't value knowledge that's produced in other languages. I mean, that's what's really happening, that we're devaluing knowledge, and there are different ways of viewing knowledge through different worldviews. And so, I mean, I think there's a real that's a real downside to the spread of English. And that's how I conclude in the book that English should be a component of a multilingual world.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation and conversation with everyone. This program was recorded and will be on the library's YouTube channel, and I highly recommend getting a copy of Rosemary's book, The Rise of English, whether through your favorite bookstore or the library itself. But thank you again, Rosemary.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting me.
Have a good night, everyone.